At 5:17 a.m. on a foggy December morning at O'Hare Airport, Captain Alyssa Monroe, a decorated former Air Force pilot with over 15,000 flight hours, walked into the crew lounge for her first day as senior captain at Meridian Airlines. But instead of receiving congratulations, she was told, "Captain Monroe, we need you to wait outside." That chilling moment triggered a chain of events no one could have imagined. Removed from her assigned flight under false pretenses, Alyssa was quietly reassigned to shadow captains, men who made it clear she didn't belong. What she uncovered behind the scenes was more than just workplace discrimination. It was a ticking time bomb, falsified maintenance logs, ignored safety checks, and a company willing to gamble with hundreds of lives to save a few dollars. How far would she go to expose the truth? And what would it cost her? Stay with us to the end, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. The hum of fluorescent lights and the aroma of burnt coffee filled the crew lounge at O'Hare International as Captain Alyssa Monroe entered in full uniform. For gold stripes adorned her sleeves, a symbol of hard-earned mastery. She carried herself with calm authority, the kind that came from flying over war zones in Afghanistan and logging more hours in the sky than most of her peers. But today, her first as senior captain at Meridian Airlines, something felt off. The moment she stepped in, conversations paused. A few flight attendants glanced up from their tablets. A couple of pilots exchanged knowing looks. Alyssa had seen it before. Less than 1% of commercial airline pilots were black women. She wasn't just a captain, she was a curiosity. She approached the coffee machine, trying to stay grounded in routine. Just as she poured a splash of cream into her cup, a voice called out behind her. "You must be Captain Monroe." She turned to find Captain Richard Whitmore, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, matching 4 stripes, extending a hand with a practiced smile. "Welcome to Meridian." "Thank you, sir," Alyssa replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Richard, please," he said, smile thinning. "I'll be your check captain for the next few weeks. The crew's waiting in briefing room C. I'll meet you there in 5. As he walked away, Alyssa's instincts kicked in. His words were polite. His tone wasn't. She'd met men like him before, ones who welcomed you with a handshake but were already preparing the first of many knives for your back. When she entered briefing room C, First Officer James Chin, young, kind-eyed, and clearly prepared, stood and greeted her with genuine enthusiasm. "Captain Monroe, I've heard great things. Looking forward to flying with you." Before she could respond, the door opened again. This time it was Thomas Barrett, Meridian's Executive Operations Director, followed by Whitmore. "There's been a change of plans," Barrett announced, not meeting Alyssa's eyes. "Captain Whitmore will be taking command of Flight 207 today. Captain Monroe, we need you to wait outside while we reassign you." The room fell into an awkward silence. Alyssa felt her cheeks burn with heat. She kept her voice even. "May I ask why? I was assigned this flight weeks ago." Barrett finally looked at her, with a condescending air. "It's a matter of experience. San Francisco is a complex approach, and you're still unfamiliar with our procedures." "With all due respect," she replied calmly, "I've flown into SFO 73 times over the last decade. In thunderstorms, in crosswinds, my qualifications were thoroughly reviewed before I was hired." "Captain Monroe," Barrett said, tone now clipped, "this isn't up for discussion. Please wait outside." She stood there for a breath. Then, with quiet dignity, she set her flight folder on the table and walked out. In the hallway, the cold bit at her more sharply than the December air. After all her years flying military cargo, managing stress levels most people couldn't comprehend, she had never felt humiliation quite like this. 10 minutes later, James stepped out. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "They're saying it's standard procedure for new captains. But I've seen 4 others start. None of them got pulled from their first flight." "What now?" she asked. "They've reassigned you to Shadow Flight 422 to Seattle." Captain Harold Wilson is flying. The name hit like a gut punch. Wilson was a relic, Meridian's most senior captain, and by reputation, a vocal opponent of diversifying the cockpit. James leaned in closer. I know this is unfair. If you ever want to file a complaint, I'll back you up. Alyssa nodded, grateful but cautious. Let me fly the Seattle run. I'll learn more by watching than by arguing. For now. Flight 422 became a test of patience. Wilson barely acknowledged her presence during the pre-flight, his body language stiff with disdain. In the cockpit, he narrated procedures with the air of someone giving driving lessons to a teenager. Alyssa said nothing. She'd spent years learning when to speak and when to observe. She watched every move, memorized every quirk in Meridian's protocol. But when Wilson tuned in the wrong approach frequency during descent, Alyssa didn't hesitate. Captain, she said evenly, Seattle approach should be on 28.35 today, not 124.75. The cockpit fell silent. Wilson paused, checked the charts, and grunted. You're right. Thank you, Captain Monroe. He adjusted the dial, but his tone remained icy. One good catch doesn't make you Meridian material. We have standards. Traditions. With respect, Alyssa said calmly, traditions evolve. They have to. Wilson turned to look at her for the first time. His eyes were blue and cold. Not at Meridian. Back in Chicago, Alyssa learned she would be shadowing more captains, all men with similar reputations. The pattern was obvious. Hazing, pressure, hoping she'd quit. She didn't. Instead, she began investigating. In the maintenance hangar, she met Marcus Jefferson, a black mechanic with 23 years under his belt. He was friendly, especially after learning they'd both grown up in Detroit. Things changed, he told her, checking an engine cowling. Used to be, safety was king. Now. Management wants faster turnarounds. Some checks that used to be mandatory are now optional. Is that even legal? Alyssa asked. He gave a grim half-smile. Legal's blurry when you've got lawyers writing your manuals. Between us? I wouldn't let my family on some of these planes. It wasn't just the racism anymore. Something deeper, darker, was at work. Then came the Las Vegas red-eye. During pre-flight, Alyssa spotted discrepancies in the maintenance log. The dates didn't align. Something felt off. When the ground crew brushed her off, she delayed the flight to recheck the aircraft, costing the airline 20 minutes. Better late than never arriving, she told James, who sat beside her, supportive but nervous. After landing safely, she was summoned to Barrett's office. You overruled our crew based on a feeling, he sneered. Based on FAA regulations, she replied. The intake valve inspection dates didn't match service records. Barrett's expression hardened. Delays cost money. Perhaps this isn't the right environment for you. Alyssa leaned in slightly. Would you like to put that in writing? The conversation ended quickly. That night, Alyssa pulled out every note she'd kept, every maintenance concern, every inappropriate reassignment, every hush-hush moment. She called her sister Zoe, a corporate attorney, and finally said the words. I need your help. They built a case. FAA violations. Retaliation. Unsafe aircraft flying under falsified maintenance logs. With help from Zoe and colleagues like James, Lauren, a flight attendant, and Marcus, Alyssa compiled everything into a report. They contacted a journalist at the Chicago Tribune. Then came the moment of truth. At a surprise meeting, Barrett and his cronies offered her hush money, sign an NDA, walk away with a severance. Alyssa smiled and calmly handed them a folder. That report has already been submitted to the FAA. And the Tribune. And it's in secure backup, in case anything happens to me, or to the people who helped me. The room went silent. Whitmore turned red. Wilson clenched his jaw. "This is blackmail," he snapped. "No," Alyssa replied. "This is accountability." She gave them 1 hour to begin grounding flights. The clock started ticking. Within days, the dominoes fell. Nearly 40% of Meridian's fleet was pulled from service. Passengers were stranded. The FAA opened a full investigation. Stocks plummeted. News coverage exploded. Barrett, Whitmore, and Wilson were suspended. Soon after, they were indicted. 6 weeks later, Alyssa sat across from James in a quiet cafe as workers removed the Meridian Airlines sign from headquarters. "Atlantic Airways is buying the assets," James said, grinning. "They're offering jobs to all certified staff, except the execs, of course." "And you?" she asked. "Senior First Officer track." He raised his coffee in a toast. "What about you?" She smiled, eyes sparkling with quiet victory. "Still weighing my options." In truth, she'd received offers from 3 airlines, a book publisher, and even the FAA. But she wasn't done yet. The skies were calling, and this time, she'd fly without chains. 3 days after the Meridian scandal broke, Alyssa Monroe stood in her modest Chicago apartment, blinds drawn against the press vans parked outside. Her phone buzzed non-stop, calls from journalists, messages from fellow pilots, interview requests from every major network. She ignored most of them. Her focus wasn't fame. It was impact. James Chen had texted that morning, crews whispering. "They say you might have just saved hundreds of lives." Maybe. But Alyssa wasn't finished yet. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, pulled on her flight jacket, and headed downtown for her meeting with the FAA. Zoe had already prepped her for everything. The agency wanted full cooperation. But they also wanted her to testify. Not just in closed-door briefings, but publicly. On the record. Before the Congressional Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. When she arrived, an FAA official named Susan Harlan met her in the lobby. Susan was sharp, professional, and unexpectedly warm. "We've been following what you've done," she said. "It's rare someone has the documentation to back up what we've always suspected." Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "You've suspected Meridian was cutting corners." "We suspected something wasn't right. But whistleblowers don't usually come with detailed maintenance logs and photos. You gave us a foundation." Inside a conference room lined with aviation blueprints and safety flowcharts, Alyssa laid out everything: how the culture at Meridian had shifted toward punishing diligence, how ground crews were being pressured to check off rather than inspect, and how captains were quietly discouraged from reporting issues. By the end of the meeting, Susan had stopped taking notes. "We're recommending criminal charges," she said finally. "Not just against the executives, but against those who falsified records knowingly. You'll be a key witness." Alyssa nodded. She wasn't afraid of the courtroom. But she knew exactly how much they'd try to discredit her. The backlash would be intense. The following week, she flew to Washington, D.C., under a pseudonym booked by Zoe. At the hearing, she wore her Meridian flight jacket, unbranded now, just navy blue fabric and gold stripes that meant more to her than any company logo ever could. In the packed chamber, representatives leaned forward as Alyssa described what it meant to delay a flight because something felt off. She explained why safety isn't just procedure, it's instinct honed by thousands of hours, backed by data and experience. She described Marcus, Lauren, James, those who had trusted her enough to step forward. And Paul Decker, the injured mechanic whose accident now looked increasingly like a cover-up. "Flying isn't just a job," she said near the end of her statement. "It's a covenant. People entrust their lives to us. That trust can't be betrayed, not for profit, not for pride, not for anything." One of the representatives, a gray-haired veteran of the Air Force, nodded solemnly and said, "Captain Monroe, you may have just changed the industry." After the hearing, Zoe met her on the steps outside. You were brilliant, she said, squeezing Alyssa's shoulder. And guess who called me during your testimony? Who? Atlantic Airways. They're offering you a captain slot, Dreamliner route, plus a position on their new internal safety board. Alyssa blinked. They're serious? They are. But that's not all. Zoe grinned. The FAA wants you to consult on national safety standards. And Penguin Random House just called. They want your story. Alyssa didn't answer right away. She looked up at the overcast sky. She didn't want revenge. She wanted change. And maybe, this was how to do it. That night, she flew home in silence, sitting in economy like everyone else. The cabin crew didn't recognize her. The pilot overhead didn't know who was sitting in 18A. But Alyssa studied every announcement, every engine hum, every flight pattern on the monitor. Not because she didn't trust the plane, but because the habit of vigilance didn't vanish overnight. Back in Chicago, she returned to the Atlantic Airways offer. A few days later, she said yes. Her first flight with Atlantic came 6 weeks later, Flight 207, Chicago to San Francisco. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Same flight number she was pulled from at Meridian. Same route she trained for. This time, she wore the captain's hat without resistance. And in the first officer's seat beside her sat Tasha Williams, a 29-year-old black woman fresh out of the academy, sharp, focused, eager. As the Dreamliner pushed back from the gate, Tasha turned and said, "Captain Monroe. I just want to say, what you did, that's why I didn't give up. My instructor told me I didn't look like a pilot. I almost believed him. Then I read about you." Alyssa smiled, adjusting the throttles. "The sky belongs to all of us, First Officer Williams. Never forget that." They lifted off into the clouds, smooth and steady, 243 passengers behind them. And Alyssa felt it, not vindication, but peace. In the months that followed, her life shifted gears. She was no longer just a pilot, she was a movement. She traveled to aviation conferences, stood on stages in Denver, Atlanta, and Seattle, speaking on the balance between tradition and accountability. She helped Atlantic implement a blind hiring system, where applications were stripped of names and photos during the first round of screening. The airline's diversity metrics doubled in 6 months. She also led safety drills in hangars, rewriting checklists with mechanics and ground crews. Marcus Jefferson, now promoted to head of maintenance quality control at Atlantic, often stood beside her, teaching younger techs the importance of resisting pressure from upstairs. Lauren Kim, the flight attendant who'd once risked everything to share a photo of a cracked cabin valve, was now a certified safety officer training crews across 4 regional hubs. But not everything was easy. One morning, Alyssa received an anonymous envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a photo of her outside Atlantic HQ with the words, "Loyalty has limits," scribbled in red pen. She turned the letter into security, notified Zoe, and moved on. She wouldn't be intimidated. The old guard had always preferred silence. She refused to give it to them. 2 months later, the Justice Department issued indictments against Barrett, Whitmore, Wilson, and 3 other Meridian executives. Charges included reckless endangerment, fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Barrett was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Whitmore and Wilson received 5. The courtroom was packed. Alyssa didn't attend. She didn't need to. She'd already won. On the first anniversary of Meridian's collapse, she sat in a quiet office at Atlantic, reviewing incident reports and writing new pilot guidelines. A junior mechanic knocked on her door, eyes wide. "Captain Monroe. CNN's on the phone. They want a quote for their segment tonight." Alyssa stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the runways were bathed in golden afternoon light. Jets taxied with precision. Crews worked with purpose. She turned back to the mechanic. "Tell them I'll speak." But only after I finish this report. Safety first. That evening, as she walked out to the parking lot, she stopped beside one of the hangars. A new mural had been painted across the side, just outlines, really, of four hands gripping one another midair. A subtle nod to unity. Below it were 6 words in white paint. The sky forgives nothing but demands truth. Alyssa smiled. She hadn't just changed an airline. She'd changed a culture. And somewhere up there, above the turbulence and cloud lines, she knew, this was just the beginning. It had been nearly 9 months since Captain Alyssa Monroe's quiet revolution brought Meridian Airlines to its knees. In that time, she'd gone from whistleblower to reform leader, from being sidelined to becoming the face of aviation safety reform across the country. But while the public saw headlines and press conferences, Alyssa lived each day navigating a more complicated reality, one filled with pressure, scrutiny, and an ever-growing weight of responsibility. At Atlantic Airways, her work had taken on new urgency. The airline was expanding rapidly, and leadership leaned on her to shape not just policy but culture. Every day, she met with engineers, pilots, crew members, and trainees. She reviewed safety protocols, rewrote training materials, and implemented a cross-check system where first officers and maintenance leads had a secure, anonymous way to flag concerns directly to the safety board she now chaired. One morning in late spring, Alyssa arrived at her office to find Tasha Williams waiting with a tense expression. The young first officer had grown into her role quickly, and Alyssa was mentoring her through the captain's qualification process. "Captain," Tasha said quietly, "you have to see this." She handed over a printed email, one that had been flagged by Atlantic's internal alert system. It was from a former Meridian employee now working at a regional affiliate under Atlantic's umbrella. The message alleged that several aircraft inherited from Meridian had passed through inspections with questionable documentation. Worse, it claimed that 2 of the mechanics responsible had previously worked under Thomas Barrett and had somehow transferred over without triggering any internal alerts. Alyssa's stomach turned. She took the email straight to Marcus Jefferson. "Why didn't we catch this during onboarding?" she asked. Marcus, ever meticulous, flipped through a folder of personnel records. Because their files were incomplete. Meridian only transferred what they were legally obligated to. The rest was lost in transition. "Do you trust them?" she asked. Marcus paused. "One of them, maybe. The other, Eli Ramos, he's got red flags. Rumors he used to adjust inspection times to keep planes flying." Alyssa didn't wait. She called a special board meeting that afternoon, laying out the findings and recommending an immediate audit of every aircraft that had come from Meridian. The board hesitated. Grounding that many planes, even temporarily, would create delays, impact revenue, and possibly attract media attention Atlantic wasn't ready for. "Captain Monroe," one executive said, "we trust your judgment. But we also need to be mindful of operations." Alyssa stood, her voice calm but unyielding. "Do you want to be Meridian 2.0? Because I assure you, that's how it starts, not with catastrophe, but with compromise." Within an hour, the board voted unanimously to approve the audit. Within 24 hours, 3 aircraft were flagged for further inspection. One of them, a Boeing 737 scheduled to fly from Dallas to Miami, had a hydraulic valve that hadn't been checked properly in over 2 months, despite what the logs showed. That discovery confirmed Alyssa's worst fear: the rot from Meridian had bled into Atlantic's system. She spent the following weeks working with Marcus, combing through every inch of the supply chain. She instituted surprise inspections. She partnered with outside consultants to vet Atlantic's safety infrastructure. And quietly, she sent Zoe a list of names, former Meridian staff who now held mid-level positions across other carriers. "We need to track where they landed," Alyssa said during a late-night call. "If it happened here, it could happen anywhere." Zoe didn't hesitate. "I'll get my team on it." Meanwhile, Alyssa continued mentoring Tasha, who was now just weeks away from her captain's exam. They often flew together, and one night during a return from Denver, they had a rare moment of quiet in the cockpit. "Ever get tired of carrying the weight?" Tasha asked. Alyssa looked out at the stars beyond the windshield. "Every day. But then I remember how close we came to disaster. And I think about passengers sleeping in the cabin, mothers, kids, veterans, teachers, just trusting us to get them home. That's the weight we carry. And it's worth it." In early June, Alyssa was invited to give the keynote address at the National Aviation Leadership Summit in Dallas. Industry executives, regulators, and union leaders would be in attendance. It was the kind of event where reputations were made, or shattered. She stepped onto the stage to polite applause, wearing her Atlantic uniform with the updated patch she helped design, a rising sun behind wings, symbolizing both vigilance and renewal. Her speech was direct, unsparing, and full of conviction. "We cannot afford selective memory," she said. "It's easy to blame Meridian's downfall on a few bad apples, but systems rot when silence becomes policy. Safety isn't just technical, it's cultural. It's how we speak up, how we listen, and how we protect those who protect others." The room fell silent as she concluded. "I was told to wait outside my first day. I will never wait again. And neither should anyone in this industry who sees something wrong." When she stepped down, several airline CEOs approached her, not with platitudes, but with invitations. They wanted her help reshaping their safety departments. Some offered advisory positions. One offered her a blank check. She turned them all down, politely, but firmly. "I'm not for sale," she said. "But I'm always willing to help build something better." By midsummer, the FAA released a nationwide directive, partially authored by Alyssa, requiring more stringent background checks during mergers and acquisitions. Atlantic, under her leadership, was praised for its transparency and reforms. But with visibility came resistance. Some pilots, especially older ones, grumbled that safety had become too political. Anonymous comments began circulating on message boards, accusing Alyssa of overcorrecting and punishing the many for the mistakes of a few. One particularly cruel post called her the affirmative action queen of the skies. James saw the posts before she did and warned her. "They're cowards," he said. "You're doing what no one else had the guts to do." Alyssa read the comments anyway. Then she closed the page and went back to work. In August, she flew to Atlanta to meet with a group of young women training at the Aviation Academy. The room was filled with energy, future captains, engineers, and air traffic controllers. They bombarded her with questions, took selfies, asked for advice. One girl, no older than 16, waited until the end to approach her. "My name's Rebecca," she said shyly. "My dad's a mechanic. He said you're the reason he speaks up now. He said you made it okay to care." Alyssa smiled, tears welling. "That's the highest compliment I've ever received," she said. "Tell him thank you." By fall, the results of Atlantic's internal audits were released: 92% compliance across all departments, a 30% increase in voluntary safety reports, and the highest employee satisfaction rating in the airline's history. Alyssa's reforms weren't just effective, they were embraced. That October, she was appointed President of Operational Safety for Atlantic Airways, the first black woman in U.S. aviation history to hold the title at a major airline. When the announcement was made, Zoe called immediately. "You're rewriting the whole industry," she said. Alyssa didn't reply right away. She was standing at the airport observation deck, watching a plane take off against a golden sky. "No," she finally said. "We're rewriting it, together." As the engines roared and the plane lifted into the air, Alyssa felt something settle within her. Not just pride. Not just purpose. But clarity. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was the foundation of something bigger. Summer was in full swing, and with it came the busiest travel season Atlantic Airways had ever seen. Delays, high passenger volume, and added pressure on staff tested even the strongest departments, but none more than safety operations. And at the center of it all, Captain Alyssa Monroe stayed steady, focused, and unshakably committed to the standards she had spent the past 2 years fighting to build. But change, she was learning, was not a straight line. It zigzagged, resisted, sometimes retreated. And now it was showing signs of pushback from within. One morning in July, James Chen knocked on her office door holding a laptop and looking uncharacteristically grim. "We've got a problem," he said. "There's been an incident. Nothing catastrophic, thank God, but it's serious." Alyssa motioned for him to sit. "What happened?" "Flight 842, return leg from Denver to Orlando. During taxi, one of the main landing gear brakes locked up. They caught it on the tarmac, but it could have gone unnoticed if not for the first officer's last-minute check." "Was anyone hurt?" "No. But the brake assembly? It wasn't flagged during the last inspection. Worse, someone signed off on it 3 days ago." Alyssa leaned forward. "Who?" "Angela Robichaud. One of the junior techs, new hire, came from Skyfast Mechanics." Alyssa knew the company. Skyfast was a third-party vendor used during peak travel seasons. It had a solid reputation, but like many outsourced teams, it operated on thin margins and high speed. "Pull her full work history. I want to see every aircraft she's touched in the last 60 days, Alyssa ordered. "And bring Marcus in." Within hours, Marcus Jefferson joined them with a stack of printouts and a tight expression. "She's efficient," he said. "Almost too efficient. Her reports are clean, almost identical, and turn in faster than most veterans on the floor." "Rushed work or cut corners?" Alyssa asked. "Hard to say. But I've already flagged 2 minor inconsistencies, nothing that would ground a plane, but enough to make you raise an eyebrow." Alyssa felt the familiar stirrings of unease. It was subtle. Not as blatant as Meridian's falsified logs or Horizon Eagle's dangerous pressure on crews. But it was the same root cause, speed over scrutiny. She asked Marcus to quietly retrain the entire team on landing gear inspections, using the incident as a case study, without naming Angela directly. She also contacted HR and began pushing for a policy: any new technician, whether hired directly or through a vendor, must undergo 30-day mentorship and cross-checks before signing solo inspections. Some on the board balked. "That slows us down during the busiest season," one executive warned. "We're already operating at reduced efficiency due to staffing shortages." "And what's the efficiency rating of a downed aircraft?" Alyssa shot back. Silence. Policy passed. The next day, Lauren Kim approached Alyssa with her own concern. "I've noticed something strange in crew rotations," she said. "Certain flight attendants, mostly newer ones, are being moved off high-priority flights and reassigned to undesirable overnight routes. No explanation. No warnings. Just, shuffled." Alyssa frowned. "Any pattern?" "They're mostly women. A few are from underrepresented backgrounds. And I've spoken to 2 who said they refuse to cut corners on pre-flight cabin prep. One even flagged a broken exit light that caused a delay. After that, she was rotated off long-haul assignments." Alyssa took it seriously. She pulled internal crew assignment data and brought it to Tasha Williams, now head of Atlantic's newly formed Equity and Inclusion Task Force. Together, they mapped out the crew changes over the last 4 months. The pattern was undeniable. Certain supervisors, especially in the Dallas and Atlanta hubs, were subtly sidelining employees who spoke up or strictly followed protocol. There was no paper trail. No emails or direct orders. But the algorithmic footprint revealed a clear trend. "This is systemic micro-retaliation," Tasha said. "Not enough to fire someone. Just enough to silence them." Alyssa stared at the boardroom display with growing anger. "We can't let it stand." She called a leadership summit. Supervisors, trainers, crew chiefs, and hub managers from across the country were summoned to Chicago for a mandatory 2-day ethics and culture reset. Alyssa delivered the keynote on day 1. Accountability doesn't end with catching the big scandals, she told them. It lives in the small choices. The invisible nudges. The pressure to play along. If we punish the people who speak up, even quietly, we will fall. And next time, we won't get a warning. Then she implemented the second major policy of the summer. Every reassignment or rotation involving safety-related feedback would require a written explanation and a second managerial sign-off. Backlash followed, mostly in whispers. Some called her heavy-handed. Others claimed morale was suffering. A few even suggested she was creating a culture of fear. But Alyssa knew better. Fear wasn't created by scrutiny. It was created by silence. And she had no intention of letting silence return to the cockpit. By August, the changes began to bear fruit. Anonymous reporting surged, not in complaints, but in praise. Crew members felt empowered to log concerns, observations, even compliments for colleagues who upheld safety. Several supervisors who had resisted the changes were quietly moved into non-management roles. And Angela Robichaux, the tech at the center of the break issue, approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "I didn't mean to cut corners," she said. "I was just trying to prove myself. I thought speed mattered most." "It doesn't," Marcus told her. "Precision does. And now you know." Instead of firing her, Alyssa and Marcus enrolled Angela in a mentorship program. 6 weeks later, she submitted the most thorough inspection report in her department. Meanwhile, Alyssa received an invitation from the FAA. They wanted her to serve as a guest lecturer at their annual Safety Leadership Symposium in Seattle. She accepted, but under one condition, that she be allowed to bring a panel of frontline workers to speak beside her. Lauren. Marcus. Tasha. James. Even Valerie. At the event, she stood before a packed auditorium of regulators, CEOs, and policymakers, and said, "We've built systems where silence is rewarded and thoroughness is punished. We need to flip that. We need to value the person who delays a flight for a faulty light as much as the person who gets it off the ground on time. Because only one of them is protecting the people on board." Afterward, a dozen executives approached her for collaboration. Change, it seemed, was no longer being resisted. It was being invited in. But Alyssa didn't celebrate yet. She walked the airport floors each week. Spoke to night shift crews. Rode jump seats with new captains. Read every whistleblower report herself. Because she knew reform wasn't a chapter. It was a daily practice. And as long as there were people flying, there had to be someone watching the skies, not just for turbulence, but for the quiet cracks that threatened everything. That someone, as always, was Captain Alyssa Monroe. Winter returned to Chicago with sharp winds and steel skies, but inside Atlantic Airways' gleaming new Safety Operations Center, Captain Alyssa Monroe sat in a quiet conference room reviewing a stack of incident reports. The walls were lined with interactive flight maps, audit dashboards, and digital whiteboards, but it wasn't the technology that made this place revolutionary, it was the culture. And Alyssa had helped build it from the ground up. It had been over a year since Meridian Airlines collapsed under the weight of its own deception, a year since Alyssa refused to wait outside that briefing room. She'd become more than a pilot, she was now president of operational safety at Atlantic, overseeing every aircraft, every procedure, and every whistle that needed blowing. Her name carried weight in the industry now, but with that weight came new enemies. One December afternoon, she received a call from Zoe. "Hey," Zoe said without pleasantries. "You need to see something." Within the hour, Alyssa was sitting in Zoe's downtown law office, reviewing a subpoena. It wasn't for her. It was for Lauren Kim. The Department of Justice had quietly opened a criminal investigation into Meridian's top executives, including charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and gross negligence. Lauren, the flight attendant who had supplied critical photo evidence of cracked cabin valves, had been listed as a key witness. But Meridian's former legal team, under a private firm now attempting to protect their reputations, was pressuring the DOJ to discredit her testimony. They claimed her photos were edited and her motives personal. "They're trying to silence her," Zoe said flatly. "And if they succeed, they'll try to erase everything." Alyssa leaned back, jaw tight. "They're not just attacking Lauren. They're going after the truth. We're going to fight it," Zoe promised. "But it's going to get ugly." That night, Alyssa invited Lauren over for dinner. They sat on the couch in sweatpants, sipping red wine and staring at the Christmas tree Alyssa had half-heartedly decorated the week before. "I'm scared," Lauren admitted. "Not of them. Of going through all this again. The pressure, the lawyers, the spotlight." "You shouldn't have to go through it alone," Alyssa said. "You didn't do this for credit. You did it because it was right." Lauren nodded. "But that doesn't stop them from dragging me through the mud." "I won't let them," Alyssa promised. In the days that followed, Alyssa called in every favor she had. Journalists who had covered the original Meridian story agreed to run pieces defending Lauren's integrity. Former FAA officials sent statements of support. Internal documents Alyssa had saved were now being re-examined to corroborate Lauren's timeline. The court of public opinion turned quickly. Social media rallied around Lauren with hashtags like #ProtectTheWhistleblowers and #TruthInTheSkies. Passengers from past flights posted messages thanking her for her courage. The DOJ held its ground. The legal firm trying to discredit Lauren quietly backed off. Still, Alyssa couldn't ignore the creeping feeling in her gut. Meridian's shadow was long, and it wasn't done reaching. By January, whispers of a new low-cost airline startup began to circulate. It was called Horizon Eagle, funded by anonymous investors and promising ultra-fast turnaround times with optimized staffing models. On the surface, it looked like innovation. But Alyssa's instincts told her otherwise. She ran a background check on Horizon Eagle's executive team. One name jumped out: Eli Ramos. The same Eli who had come over from Meridian during the Atlantic merger. The one flagged in an internal audit for possibly falsifying inspection logs. After Alyssa's team had exposed him, he quietly resigned. Now he was Chief Operating Officer at Horizon Eagle. She shared the findings with Zoe. "He's setting up a new Meridian," Alyssa said. "With fewer regulations and less oversight. If we don't act, this whole thing starts over." Zoe leaned forward. "Then we act." Alyssa arranged a meeting with FAA officials and representatives from the Department of Transportation. She presented a 42-page briefing on Horizon Eagle's concerning practices, including their hiring of multiple former Meridian staffers, their lack of transparent maintenance protocols, and an aggressive policy that gave flight crews just 30 minutes between arrivals and departures, half the industry average. "We're not asking you to shut them down," Alyssa said. "We're asking for a full audit before someone dies." The FAA agreed to a preliminary investigation. Meanwhile, Atlantic made its own moves. Under Alyssa's leadership, they issued a public commitment: they would not code-share, cooperate, or contract with any airline that failed to meet baseline safety and transparency standards. Other airlines followed suit. Horizon Eagle suddenly found itself under scrutiny, struggling to secure contracts and gate access at major airports. In retaliation, Horizon's PR team began leaking false rumors about Alyssa, claiming she had overstepped her role, misused FAA contacts, and targeted competitors out of personal vendettas. They even claimed she was never a combat pilot. It didn't take. Too many people had flown with her. Too many had trusted her judgment. Too many owed their careers, and their lives, to her courage. Tasha Williams, now a full captain flying transatlantic routes, posted a message online. "If Captain Monroe says a plane is unsafe, I don't need paperwork. I trust her more than gravity." The post went viral. A week later, the FAA grounded 5 Horizon Eagle planes for inspection. Alyssa wasn't finished. In early February, she delivered a speech at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. The room was filled with cadets, mechanics, engineers, and policy leaders. She stood beneath the Spirit of St. Louis and spoke with quiet fire. "We've made incredible progress," she said. "But progress is not permanent. It's something we must protect, flight by flight, decision by decision. Every time we let profit come before people, we gamble with lives. And the sky doesn't forgive that kind of gamble." By spring, the DOJ announced formal indictments against Horizon Eagle's leadership for falsifying compliance documents and retaliating against employees who raised concerns. Eli Ramos was arrested trying to board a private jet out of Miami. It was a victory, but a sobering one. Back in Chicago, Alyssa took a day off, her first in weeks. She visited Paul Decker at the Rehabilitation Center where he was now working as a mentor for injured veterans. His back injury had ended his career, but not his purpose. "You did it," he told her, wheeling beside her in the center's courtyard. "You burned it all down." "No," she said softly. "We built something better from the ashes." They sat in silence for a moment, watching planes cross the spring sky overhead. Before she left, Paul handed her a folded paper. "Thought you should have this." It was the original maintenance report he had written up on the 787 engine mounts, the one that disappeared after his fall. It had somehow survived in a drawer of his garage. Alyssa smiled and tucked it into her coat pocket. That evening, as she walked the floor of Atlantic's control tower during peak departures, she paused to look down at the tarmac. Crew members moved in smooth rhythm, no one rushing, no steps skipped. It was everything she'd fought for. Marcus Jefferson approached, clipboard in hand. "Just heard," he said. "Lauren's been officially cleared as a key witness. DOJ's building their final case." Alyssa nodded. "Good. She deserves peace." "And you?" Marcus asked. "What do you want now?" She looked out over the runway. "Just this," she said. "A world where people do the right thing before someone has to risk everything to force it." The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light across the field. Another flight took off, its lights blinking against the darkening sky. And Alyssa Monroe, the woman once told to wait outside, smiled quietly. Because now, she was the one opening doors for others. Spring blossomed across Chicago, but inside Atlantic Airways headquarters, the air buzzed with quiet urgency. A year and a half had passed since Alyssa Monroe grounded her first aircraft over a suspicious maintenance log, an act of courage that had not only dismantled Meridian Airlines but reshaped the very fabric of the aviation industry. Now, as president of operational safety, she found herself balancing two demanding roles: protector of the skies, and quiet reformer of a culture too long rooted in silence. On a Tuesday morning in May, she stepped into a small auditorium filled with junior pilots and safety trainees. Today wasn't a press event or keynote speech, this was hands-on. The kind of engagement Alyssa valued most. The room settled as she approached the podium. "Safety," she began, her voice clear, "isn't about following rules when someone's watching. It's about doing what's right when no one is." She told them stories, not the kind splashed across headlines, but quiet victories: a mechanic who spoke up about corrosion near a fuel line, a flight attendant who halted boarding over a strange smell, a dispatcher who flagged a pattern of overnight fatigue incidents. Stories where lives were saved not by heroics, but by vigilance. After the talk, a tall young woman with a crew cut approached her. "Captain Monroe," she said, "I'm Valerie Reeds. First officer, just certified. I wanted to thank you. My dad was a passenger on Flight 337, the one you grounded last fall. Turns out the pressurization valve really was faulty. He never knew. But I did. That's why I joined the program." Alyssa smiled. "Thank you for telling me. And welcome aboard. You're exactly who we need in this industry. Later that afternoon, she returned to her office to find James Chin waiting. You're not going to like this, he said, handing her a thin folder. Inside were preliminary reports from the FAA's rotating inspection team. One of the airlines flagged for inconsistent maintenance record-keeping. Sunrise Air. They've been expanding fast, James explained. New routes, aggressive schedules. Some of their 737s were bought from the same scrap lot Meridian used before they went under. Alyssa flipped through the documents, her brow furrowing. Is Eli Ramos involved? James shook his head. No. He's still facing sentencing. But the CFO at Sunrise is a former Meridian finance exec, Miriam Blunt. She testified she didn't know about the falsified logs at the time. Alyssa didn't believe in coincidences. Have we shared gates with them? She asked. Only in Dallas and Phoenix. Minimal overlap. Pull any shared maintenance vendors. And reach out to Marcus. I want a safety team shadowing their flights quietly. Let's not wait until the FAA tells us we have a problem. Within a week, her concerns were validated. A Sunrise Air flight out of Tampa was grounded due to a flap failure discovered during taxi. The mechanic on site? A former Meridian contractor flagged years earlier for neglecting repair sign-offs. Sunrise's CEO issued a lukewarm press release about growing pains, but Alyssa wasn't interested in optics. She forwarded her team's findings to the FAA, then drafted an internal memo outlining Atlantic's immediate disassociation from any shared operations with Sunrise until a full audit was complete. When the board questioned the move, citing market share loss, Alyssa stood firm. Trust, she said, is more valuable than any seat filled. Once we lose it, we don't get it back. Boardroom silence. Then a unanimous vote of support. That night, as Alyssa walked through O'Hare's Terminal 2, she paused at Gate C-14 where an Atlantic flight was boarding. She watched as a father helped his daughter lift her backpack into the overhead bin, as an elderly couple held hands while settling into row 7. These were the people she thought about with every report she read, every decision she made. At the coffee kiosk, she ran into Lauren Kim, now wearing a blazer and Atlantic Safety Officer badge. Heading to the audit in Houston, Lauren said, sipping a cappuccino. Can you believe I used to serve peanuts in row 9? You still carry that same fire, Alyssa said warmly. Lauren hesitated. Actually, I've been thinking. There's something bigger I want to do. I want to build something like what you've done, but for cabin crew. A national alliance. Education, reporting protection, trauma recovery. Alyssa nodded slowly. You should. And when you're ready, I'll back it. The next morning, she received a letter from the Department of Transportation. She had been selected to co-chair a new Federal Aviation Safety Reform Council, an independent body empowered to propose national legislation on aircraft maintenance accountability, whistleblower protections, and pilot mental health. Zoe called minutes later, already reading the announcement online. They're finally listening, Zoe said. You've changed the air we fly through. Alyssa smiled but said nothing. Because she knew the fight wasn't over. In June, she traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify again before Congress. This time, the tone was different. Less confrontational. More reverent. Lawmakers had seen what happened when the industry ignored voices like hers. They asked about Sunrise Air, about foreign outsourcing of maintenance work, and about the future of AI in aviation safety. Technology is a tool, she told them. But culture is the pilot. If we don't fix how people think, about safety, about responsibility, no innovation will save us. Afterward, a young congressional staffer stopped her outside the chamber. My mom was on Meridian Flight 422 to Seattle, he said. She was terrified of flying after what came out. But last month, she flew again, for the first time in years. She told me, if Captain Monroe is still up there, I'm not afraid. Alyssa reached out, shook his hand, and thanked him. But her voice caught as she walked away. She didn't seek admiration. She sought assurance that this work, this endless vigilance, was worth it. On the 4th of July, Atlantic hosted a company-wide celebration at their Denver hub. Staff from across the country attended: pilots, engineers, janitors, executives, and their families. Alyssa rarely attended these events, but this year she stood near the main stage as fireworks shimmered behind the hangars. James took the mic and spoke to the crowd. "We all know why we're here," he said. "We fly together because we trust each other. And we trust each other because one person refused to let safety be optional." He gestured toward her. "To Captain Alyssa Monroe. The reason we're still flying strong." The applause rolled like thunder. Alyssa stepped up, took the mic, and looked out at the faces illuminated by flickering light. "I never set out to be the face of anything," she said. "I just wanted to do my job right. And I wanted the people around me to feel safe doing theirs." She paused. "We don't always get to choose the battles we fight. But we always get to choose how we fight them. With courage. With truth. And with each other." She raised her glass. "To the skies we protect. And the people we protect them for." That night, as the final firework burst into gold over the tarmac, Alyssa felt something shift inside her. Not an ending. Not even a victory. But a new kind of beginning. One where safety wasn't just her mission, it was everyone's. Where no one would ever be told to wait outside again. And where every child who looked up at a plane cutting through the clouds could dream not just of flying, but of leading, protecting, and reshaping the world from 30,000 feet above. Late summer in Chicago brought sweltering heat and bright skies, but inside Atlantic Airways' executive wing, a storm was quietly brewing. Captain Alyssa Monroe, now in her second year as President of Operational Safety, sat at her desk reviewing a series of urgent memos. The Department of Transportation had just issued a new directive. Each major airline was required to submit a 5-year safety reform blueprint outlining protocols for training, maintenance, hiring, and whistleblower protections. The deadline was tight. The stakes were higher than ever. Alyssa leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the framed quote that hung above her desk, a line from her testimony before Congress: "The sky forgives many things, but it never forgives lies." She would not let this become just another government formality. This blueprint needed to be real, bold, honest, and transformative. She summoned her core team to the conference room. James Chen was the first to arrive, followed by Lauren Kim and Marcus Jefferson. All three had become more than colleagues, they were the spine of a culture shift Alyssa had led. With them came Valerie Reeds, now a newly minted captain, and Tasha Williams, recently promoted to Atlantic's Diversity and Leadership Training Council. "We've got 3 weeks," Alyssa began, "to draft something that will define not just our future, but what safety leadership looks like in this country." James nodded. "Most carriers will hand in recycled policy and call it innovation." "Exactly," Alyssa replied. "That's not good enough. I want something that puts people first, every voice, every job title, every risk." They worked long hours, diving deep into Atlantic's internal data, reviewing past near misses, assessing employee satisfaction, and reaching out to frontline workers for insight. Alyssa insisted that the plan include everything from pilot fatigue management to anonymous reporting access for baggage handlers. Safety wasn't just about mechanics and aircraft, it was about human culture. But midway through week 2, something happened that shook the entire team. A small regional carrier based in New Mexico, Mesa Desert Lines, suffered a fatal crash just outside Albuquerque. The aircraft went down during descent, killing all 32 on board, including 2 children and a retired firefighter. Initial reports cited loss of control due to possible mechanical failure. Alyssa's heart sank when she read the preliminary findings. Marcus burst into her office the next morning, his face pale. "The plane was a refurbished 737, he said. "Bought from a liquidation sale. Same lot Meridian once used. Alyssa took a breath. Maintenance history. Spotty. Logbooks were reconstructed from multiple sources. Guess who signed off on it last month? Don't tell me. Derek Foster. Former Meridian contractor. Quietly hired by Mesa last year. The room went silent. Alyssa clenched her fists. This should have ended with Meridian. It didn't, Lauren said. It just shifted. By nightfall, the FAA had grounded all Mesa Desert Lines flights for investigation. The media turned its attention back to old ghosts, and Alyssa's name surfaced again, only this time with a new question: had enough been done? She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she walked through the maintenance hangars at O'Hare, watching as ground crews performed overnight inspections. The buzz of drills and flashlights moving across wings was oddly calming. Here, in the quiet, she saw the people she was fighting for, exhausted but precise, underpaid but proud. The next day, she added an entirely new section to the safety blueprint: industry contamination prevention. It proposed a national safety certification system for all maintenance personnel, transferable across airlines and monitored by an independent governing body. No more silent rehirings. No more disappearing bad actors. She brought the proposal to the board the following week. Some balked. It'll require congressional funding, one said. It may take years. We don't have years, Alyssa replied sharply. We have funerals. The room fell still. And then, one by one, they agreed. Meanwhile, Zoe had been watching the Mesa case unfold from Washington. She called Alyssa with a quiet urgency. You need to prepare, she warned. The Mesa families are organizing. Lawsuits are coming. And you're about to be subpoenaed, not because you did anything wrong, but because your name is now synonymous with accountability. Alyssa sighed. Then I'll stand where I've always stood. 2 weeks later, she sat across from a panel of federal investigators. They asked about her time at Meridian, about the warning signs she'd uncovered, about the maintenance records she'd tried to trace through third-party vendors. Her voice never wavered. When asked if she believed the Mesa crash could have been prevented, she paused before answering. Yes, she said. Not because someone made one mistake, but because we've allowed a culture of recycling danger without accountability. This isn't about one airline. It's about a system that forgets too quickly. The families watched from behind the glass wall. Some wept. One mother mouthed the words "thank you." In the weeks that followed, Alyssa met privately with victims' families. She shared her own story, answered their questions, and listened, truly listened. She wasn't there to defend the industry. She was there to honor the truth. After one emotional meeting, a father named Dean Richards, who had lost his wife and teenage son in the crash, handed Alyssa a folded napkin. On it was a drawing his son had made, of a plane, soaring above the clouds, with the words, "Fly safe," scribbled in red crayon. Alyssa took it back to her office and framed it. She made it the final page of the safety blueprint. When Atlantic submitted the document to the Department of Transportation in early September, it was 178 pages long, packed with real voices, painful lessons, and bold proposals. It wasn't just a compliance file. It was a roadmap. The press called it the most comprehensive safety plan in modern aviation history. Soon after, Alyssa was invited to speak at the White House Aviation Summit. Leaders from across the globe gathered to hear from the woman who'd become a symbol, not just of reform, but of resilience. She stood beneath the American flag, flanked by union leaders, regulators, and executives. Her voice was clear, grounded, and quietly defiant. "We must stop treating tragedy as the price of doing business," she said. "The true measure of leadership is what we do when no one's watching. I was once told to wait outside a door because I didn't fit someone's image of who belonged. But I kept walking. I opened my own door. And I brought others through it." The room erupted in applause. That night, As she flew home in the cockpit of Flight 245 from D.C. to Chicago, Alyssa sat beside Tasha, who now served as lead training supervisor for Atlantic's National Flight Academy. "You think it'll stick?" Tasha asked mid-descent. "It already has," Alyssa said. "You're proof." They landed smoothly beneath a violet sky. And somewhere above the clouds, where old mistakes once threatened lives, a new standard had taken root, not just in policy, but in people. Because Captain Alyssa Monroe didn't just rewrite aviation rules. She rewrote who got to shape them. Captain Alyssa Monroe's journey teaches us that standing up for what's right often comes with a cost, but the cost of silence is always greater. Whether you're in the skies or on the ground, integrity, courage, and vigilance save lives. Alyssa didn't set out to become a hero. She simply refused to accept a system built on fear and convenience. Her story reminds us that change starts when one person dares to speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when they're told to wait outside. If this story moved you, or made you think differently about courage and accountability, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell me what stood out to you most. And if you believe stories like Alyssa's matter, stories of justice, resilience, and quiet bravery, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps keep these powerful stories alive and shared with those who need them most.